Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for joining us today for our conversation about organized crime and violent crime in South America. I am Dr. Wanda Brown, Director of the Initiative on Nonstate Armed Actors and co-director of the Africa Initiative, as well as Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And it is a great pleasure today for me to partner up with the Center for Strategic Policy and Global Affairs of Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina for this event. This is the second time that we are doing together. We have done another event in May on illegal fishing. Latin America has long stood out in terms of criminal violence. It is by far the world's most violent region, with all manner of criminality, both very intense and often far more violent than in other parts of the world. And the reasons and explanations are far more complex than simply the fact that intense drug trafficking takes place in the region. In East Asia, there is as much drug production and consumption as there is in Latin America, arguably more consumption of drugs. And yet violence levels are radically different, much lower, often by 2 orders of magnitude. So what accounts for the violence, and what are the violence patterns and changes that we have been seeing recently? Well, one of the big overarching themes influencing all criminal market around the world is the synthetic drugs revolution. It is sweeping drug markets from Afghanistan to Australia, from the United States to Latin America, and even emerging in Africa. In the United States and North America more broadly, Canada as well, fentanyl is obviously the drug that is dominating the US drug market. This supply-driven epidemic, fentanyl epidemic, is already the world's most lethal drug epidemic ever in history. Initiated originally by the legal market in opioids in the United States, a devastation that an illegal market could not have caused. And it is affecting countries with very different drug policies, such as Canada and British Columbia, arguably the place in the world with the most advanced harm reduction and most expansive harm reduction approaches. Yet even there, the death rates from fentanyl and synthetic opioids are parallel to those of the United States. And what is, of course, significant about fentanyl in North America and the emergence of other synthetic drugs and their robust dominance, such as methamphetamine, is that this is deeply influencing the relations between crime and US and Latin American drug policies. In the United States, the cocaine market is in stagnation or even decline. It is principally kept alive through the fact that fentanyl is being mixed into cocaine. And in Western Europe, cocaine is still at a very high peak after decades of heroin dominating that space. But this change in the United States toward fentanyl, toward methamphetamine, has also led to a significant reprioritization of US foreign policy toward Latin America and toward drugs more broadly. Recently, a summit took place in Cali, hosted by the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, on the Latin American and Caribbean Conference on Drugs that sought to create the Drug Policy Alliance to jointly resist, to jointly engage with what was the 1990s caricature of the US war on drugs. But this is not where the US focus is today. But even as we are seeing these dramatic changes in the global drug markets and in the relations between Latin America and North America in drug supply, we are also seeing the opposite trend, the expansion of the Mexican cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación globally, as well as across Latin America. And their bipolar war that's spanning the 2 continents has set off new violence patterns, as well as intensified homicide rates. And we are seeing many countries that had previously fought to have successful anti-crime policies now being affected. So those are all some of the big structural issues that are interacting with local crime markets that we are going to be exploring in our conversation today. A conversation that will focus on Uruguay, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, countries that often receive far less attention in Washington, D.C., and even globally than Mexico and Colombia. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have a very distinguished set of speakers to be discussing those issues with us today. They include Dr. Diego Sanjurjo, Dr. Lucia Damer, Mr. Diego Fleitas, Dr. Will Friedman, and as well Dr. Alberto Foric. He is the director of the Center for Strategic Policy and Global Affairs at the Universidad de San Andrés, and he is my co-host for the event today. Alberto, please give us your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Wanda. It's a pleasure for me and for our university to be co-hosting this event with you and with Brookings. This is a series of seminars. This is part of a series of seminars that we hosted on other issues as well. And today we have a fantastic set of experts along Latin America, as you were mentioning, in countries that are not necessarily in the mainstream discussion on drugs, but which have a significant impact in global markets. So for us, it's very important that we consider these trends that are not anymore focused only in Mexico or only in Colombia, and that are, of course, causing a lot of significant turmoil, for example, in Ecuador and in Brazil. Some countries that are not considered in this seminar are also witnessing a variety of deep changes, such as Paraguay. So the whole region is going through a series of changes that may have impacts in countries around the world. So thank you very much for this seminar, and I hope that we have a thoughtful and fruitful conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alberto. You are absolutely right. This is an issue that is only growing in complexity, and that requires urgent as well as thoughtful attention as populations in Latin America are suffering and states are being deeply affected. I am very delighted that today we are joined by Dr. Diego Sanjurjo, who is going to be the first speaker. He is the coordinator of Focused Police Crime Prevention Strategies at the Ministry of Interior in Uruguay. He is also the lecturer at the Catholic University of Uruguay. A political scientist specializing in public policy, security, and development, he held various positions as a researcher and lecturer at Spanish and Uruguayan universities and think tanks. He's also the author of the book Gun Control Policies in Latin America, as well as various academic publications. And he writes a weekly opinion column in the Uruguayan newspaper, El Observador. Dr. Sanjurjo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Wanda. Thank you to the Brookings Institution. Thank you to the Universidad de San Andrés, to my fellow speakers, and to everybody listening. So first of all, to put it a little bit into context, crime in Uruguay has, from a historic point of view, has been gradually increasing or growing since the end of the dictatorship in the 80s. So gradually, homicides and violent robberies, for instance, have been growing steadily since the 80s until pretty much recent times. The current government, of which I'm a part of, we came into office in 2020. We came into office 1 week before the COVID pandemic. And what happened afterwards was that most types of crime that we measure started reducing. And this happened for most crimes. So from 2020 until the present, violent robberies, normal robberies, and other types of crime have been lowered pretty much substantially, like 10%, 20%, 30%. But once the pandemic, subsided and people started doing their normal lives again, homicides spiked again, and they went pretty much to the levels that they were in 2019, which are pretty high, I would say. We have currently a rate of 11.8 homicides for every 100,000 inhabitants, which is, I think, is pretty high, and it's unacceptably high, I would say. Now, which are the causes of homicides? This is a big part of the problem. Since the 90s until today, homicides that are somehow related to other criminal activities are the ones that have increased significantly. So today, between 60% and 70% of all homicides are somehow connected to other criminal activities, mostly everything that is related to drug selling in certain neighborhoods of the capital, mostly. And one interesting indicator is that 80% of all homicide victims last year had already a criminal record behind them. So that tells us a lot about how we have a population of people somehow related to the drug trade that are killing each other in very specific neighborhoods of the capital. On the other hand, one of the questions that was asked was if there are external criminal actors in Uruguay. Luckily for us, we don't have any evidence of that so far. So every now and then, somebody related to a big criminal group, mostly a Brazilian criminal group, is found in Uruguay, and it gets sent back to Brazil, for instance. But we in the Ministry of Interior don't have any evidence of criminal actors acting in Uruguay in a coordinated way. What does this mean? It means that every now and then we find somebody who is somehow related to Brazilian or Argentinian organized groups that is found in Uruguay and gets into prison. But he seems to be acting independently or autonomously, not in an organized fashion from Brazil or from Argentina. Organized crime in Uruguay is a much more, I would say, less organized than in other parts of the region. We have very small groups. These are usually part of a family, of a very small clan, never more than maybe 20 members. And it's a very dynamic nature, like groups start to sell drugs in one instance, then they get sent to jail, they get dismembered, then they join other groups. It's always a dynamic that is very close to family, clans or friends, or somebody who knew each other from the neighborhood and so forth. It's never a big organizations like we have in other parts of the region. And at the same time, and ending because I know my time is up, the other question was how this associates to Uruguay's, to the legalization of cannabis in Uruguay, which happened in 2014 and came to action in 2017. The use of cannabis was growing when legalization was enacted, and it continued growing basically. And the analysis that we have both from the academia as by government show that apparently the legalization of cannabis had no real incidence on crime. So I don't think there's time to get into the specifics of how the legalization of cannabis exists here in Uruguay, but it doesn't seem to have any effect on crime, nor negatively nor positively. What we know is that the perceived risk of cannabis has lowered, and that meant that consumption of cannabis has increased, but at the same time it has increased in other countries of the region, so we don't really know if legalization had an impact on that either. We don't have, as I said, any evidence that this is somehow related to a rise in crime or lower crime. So these are different things that are happening, in parallel. And what we can say basically is that organized crime in Uruguay is, again, as I said, mostly focused on narcotics and in the drug trade, and in some very specific neighborhoods of the capital. And that is what the government is trying to challenge in these last 3 years. But I'm going to talk about that in the second part of my
your presentation.
My presentation, exactly.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanjurjo. This was really a terrific overview, very useful, because Uruguay is precisely a country that does not get enough exposure, even as we are seeing some maturation of the organized crime market, though far behind that of Brazil, for example. But just one quick clarification question. So you mentioned that most homicides are linked to drug trafficking. This would be of cocaine transiting through Uruguay or staying in Uruguay. Can you just very quickly explain that?
Well, Uruguay was historically a transit country. Mostly cocaine, came to Uruguay from the producer countries, and it was sent to the US or to Europe or to Africa or to other parts. And this has slowly changed as Uruguay, as the Uruguayan economy grew. So slowly we became also a destination country. And the problem in Uruguay is basically cocaine and pasta base, which is something very similar to crack. It is a derivative of cocaine, and that is what is thriving these killings and the drug trade in these neighborhoods of the capital. Exactly. So it is cocaine and pasta base, which is something very similar to crack.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I look very much forward to your comments about the policies that the government has adopted and their effectiveness, which is also something that I am delighted to be discussing with Dr. Lucia Damerd, who is one of these researchers who, in addition to her stellar research career, also has significant influence on policies and frequently interacted in direct ways with governments. She is the professor at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile. In the past 25 years, as I mentioned, she held various advisory positions with national and local governments, as well as with multilateral institutions and research organizations specializing in the issues of security, conflict, and urban violence in Latin America. Among her most recent of such appointments, between March and October 2022, she was the chief of advisors of the president of Chile. Between 2017 and 2021, Dr. Damerd was a member of the advisory board on disarmament issues of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And between 2018 and 2020, she was also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. And she is the author of many publications, books, and other academic publications on crime and security in Latin America. Dr. Damerd, Dr. Sanjurjo mentioned the phenomenon that we have seen almost without fail everywhere in the world, that during COVID, at least the initial months, year of COVID, crime rates came significantly down, and then they swung up again. We have been seeing this from Nigeria to Pakistan, from Indonesia to Mexico. What it's been like in Chile, and what are the patterns of violence, homicides, organized crime in Chile?
Thank you, Wanda, for the invitation. It's so great to see all friends from, for so many years here in this conversation. And let me say that this is an important moment, because this is the moment in which we realize that best practices are no longer best practices. Because for almost 20 years, every time we talked about crime in Latin America, we always say, well, everything is really bad. However, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile, they make a different scenario because they organize, good policies, because they have sound investment in the police, so on and so forth. And in the last year, exactly, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile are witnessing an increasing amount of homicide rates and violence in general. So I think that Chile, first of all, is no longer a country that sees organized crime and violence in general from a distance. This is a very important change from 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Although it's still a safe country in terms of the amount of widespread violence through the streets, this is not something that we are, witnessing or experiencing here. But we do have at least 5 trends that I think are important to mention. First of all, we have an increasing homicide rate that, of course, has risen after the COVID pandemic. And as Diego mentioned, it's something that we have to take into account. The latest information shows that our rate is 6.7, which of course is really low for Mexican, Colombian, Central American standards. But for us, it's something coming from 2.8. Not that far away, something that we really need to take into account. But it is important also to say that, in order to be more precise in the analysis of homicides, and this is something that I just also read on the Uruguayan case, we need to see how regional homicide is developing. And we have Arica and Tarapacá, which are the regions in the northern part of Chile, with the rates of 17.1 and 13.4. So those are rates that are, worrisome in most cases. And there are the specific communes or districts that also have important homicide rates. Homicides are still very much like every homicide in Latin America. Most men are the victims. Most of those who are victims have prior records linked to criminal activities. However, there's an increasing level of armed violence, and this is the second trend that I think is important. There is this increasing armed violence and territorial presence of local criminal organization is something that we have to take into account. This is not new, but it's consolidating. And I think that there is lack of real profound analysis on how COVID allowed for those local criminal organizations to get rooted in those specific areas that were, areas that they have presence before, but now they have, a strong presence, and they're, in some cases, they fight, the presence of the state. The third trend is the increasing levels of drug consumption. And this is something, it is impossible to explain drug trafficking without taking a look at what happened with drug consumption. And we have 38% of people saying that they have been using marijuana in their lives, 6.6% of cocaine consumption. And those are numbers that show an increase, a constant increase in the last perhaps 15 years. So of course, the increasing size of the market is something that we have to take into account in order to understand why criminal organizations are not only growing, but also fighting to each other in terms of market domination. The fourth trend it's clear that there is not only drug problems, but there are other criminal organization areas or other illegal markets. And we have illegal mining, we have human trafficking, we have trafficking of migrants for a long while with a specific group of people from Latin America. We have illegal logging too. So there are many, there are many illegal markets moving within Chile. Of course, drugs is the first one. It's more evident, but I think that we have to really open the door in order to understand the whole ecosystem of illegal markets, because those illegal markets, in some sense, are getting together or have very adjacent borders. The last trend is that, of course, Chile plays an important role in the regional trade. In the UNODC report of 2020, the report showed that Chile was the third country from where drugs were shipped to Europe. So that opens, that sheds some light on the role that Chileans, criminal organizations, and even international organizations were having here. It's interesting that the UNODC report of 2023 does show a completely different scenario, and a scenario that increases the presence of the movement of cocaine through Europe from through Uruguay and Paraguay area. But it's clear that we have, a specific roles in the regional part. So that gets linked to the presence of, this is another question that you sent me, the presence of global or regional groups. And my sense is that, of course, there have to be good links, because we are not cocaine producers. Human trafficking is not something that is organized here. Basically, we are also most of the time, in the process or a final destination. But I am not sure. There is still anecdotal evidence, highly portrayed by media reports, that the Sinaloa cartel or Jalisco Nueva Generación or el Tren de Aragua are basically, here. So I think that we really need to stop a little bit and redefine what we are understanding about the migration of these criminal groups. Because one thing is to have really a franchise, to have a chapter of the Tren de Aragua here or anywhere in Latin America for that reason. And another different situation is to have copycats, of to have people who were migrants or who are located in Chile, who have specific ties based on the market with either Tren de Aragua or Sinaloa or Jalisco Nueva Generación. And this is very different from Peru, because of course in Peru and Bolivia, because they are cocaine producers, criminal organizations have a different interest of being located in those countries. So my sense is that we do have anecdotal evidence of these connections, but we still need more solid evidence in terms of saying that we really have, the presence of those organizations here. I don't know if I have some more time, but I can leave the policies for the next part.
I apologize to everyone. I'm struggling with technical issues all day long. I'll probably keep my mic running and just try to be quiet, as that's one of the challenges that I've been dealing with. Lucia, thank you so much for your remarks, and we will come in the second round to the policy recommendations. But thank you also for the nuance and your very perceptive remarks that the presence of an external organized crime group can have many different facets and can take place in very many different forms, as well as to highlighting to us what is indeed also a trend around the world, that being able to appropriate the name of a big armed actor, of a big criminal groups, brings all kinds of advantages. So, the three thieves from the road to Tirincot would often call themselves the Taliban. And at some point, they might have become the Taliban, but it doesn't mean that the interaction is always there. And certainly in the Asia space, we have often seen a significant fragmentation of the drug trafficking route, where different actors would smuggle through fairly limited amount of territory and hand over to another actor. Now, this is taking place, as we mentioned, with a significant push both by Sinaloa as the pioneer and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación into different parts of the world. So much to watch and much to think about from policy perspectives, how to prevent some of the worst manifestations of the arrival of those two groups and their fighting with each other and through proxies into countries like Chile. Diego, let me turn to you now to tell us about Argentina. Dr. Diego Fleitas is a research associate at the Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina and a leading Latin American policy expert on violence and security. He has served as a consultant at the World Bank, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the UN Development Program, the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as many other international and multilateral organizations and the Research Institute. Among those previous positions is that he served as the director of the Policy Design and Statistics at the Ministry of Security in Argentina. He also served as director of the award-winning NGO Asociación para Políticas Públicas. Diego, Argentina is another place where potentially we are seeing a maturation of organized crime and where things are in flux. What's going on there?
Well, Wanda, thank you very much. Also to Brookings for this invitation. And first, I wanted to highlight some questions of the regional context which impact on the organized crime dynamic. Changes in the drug market, particularly the rocketing cocaine production abroad, of course, but which put pressures in export routes, including Argentina, its international waterway, or hidrovia, which channels the regional exports. A good part of the cocaine traffic goes through this hidrovia. Also, there have been a few fentanyl cases in the region, including 24 deaths in Argentina with cocaine mixed with an opioid. But beyond that event, the fentanyl hasn't really expanded in our country so far. On the other hand, it is worth mentioning the pandemic, as Diego and Lucia said, as a particular dynamic. The political unrest also linked with the pandemic and other causes, and ideological challenges across the region and changes, but the government changes, which impacted not only in crime dynamics, but also in government attitude toward crime or the mentioned growth in cocaine production. I think all these problems are linked. Regarding international organized crime, it is worth noting that Argentina, it is not so much a warfare place like Lucia and Diego said about Uruguay and Chile. But Argentina is a haven, a money laundering place for Brazilian, Colombian, Mexican, Italian, or Chinese groups. However, there are some international groups here operating in order to provide logistics for cocaine exports. The Primer Comando da Capital have had some specific activities and local counterparts, including in prisons, but not so far a broad presence. Anyway, it is still worrisome because they are really close and they have a large level of power and violence. In addition, in some shanty towns, there is a presence of Peruvian or Paraguayan criminal groups, but in some specific places. Nonetheless, in Argentina, there is not a broad control of territory or routes by foreign groups. But what we find is that there are many medium or small-sized local groups, which in some places enjoy the protection or inaction by local police, politicians, or judiciary. Perhaps the largest groups is Los Monos in Rosario. They have, as a whole, 200 members. And the core is, of course, smaller. So we don't have many large groups, so we don't have large groups at all. These organizations have a broad scope of activities: micro-trafficking, extortion, robbery, corruption, and also links with football hooligans. And it is worth notice that in most of the violence in Argentina is linked with these small-scale activities, not with international drug trafficking. In comparison with the region, Argentina has a low homicide rate, 4.2. Although this figure suffers a serious under-recording, it will be still low if we increase it 30%, for example. If the rate is in reality 6, it will be low for Latin American standards, probably lower than many United States cities. However, we have one exception, that is Rosario City, the Argentine Chicago, which has an homicide rate of 22, in which there is a gang warfare going on. A constellation of causes impact the situation in Rosario. It is one of the main ports in the Uruguay for export, but also to transfer cocaine. Its suburbs had an influx of poor population from Argentina, of local migration. Also, there was certain previous expertise and workforce on crime linked, for example, with hooligans. And also in Santa Fe and Rosario, there were corruption problems of local police and politicians, and also failed police and judiciary reforms. To compare the Rosario case with the Uruguayan case, I think it is interesting because they had similar story and dynamics. Regarding policies on organized crime and drug trafficking, it is worth noting that in Argentina, in the last years, there was certain decrease of efforts on anti-narcotics operations, as well as of control of crime groups in prisons. What is in part explained by the pandemic, but I think that also due to ideological or political considerations in the government. In addition, we suffer chronic problems in intelligence and investigation efforts, and in the connection with judiciary process. These problems were not solved by police and judiciary reforms, and I think that is a problem similar to the rest of Latin America. Finally, thinking about opportunities and challenges regarding international cooperation on security in Argentina and the region, I think that this cooperation entails certain additional resources that are useful, but at the same time, the international cooperation sometimes provokes biases and noises in political development about security. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Diego. You know, many of the themes I think are starting to emerge in our conversation. One quick follow-up. Lucia made a very important comment. She said we cannot think about drug trafficking without focusing also on what's happening with drug consumption. And the notion that countries are simply transit countries often evaporates within some amount of time. This is one of the reasons why we are seeing the surge in homicides in Costa Rica. What is the current official or unofficial NGO assessment of cocaine consumption rates in Argentina?
I don't remember. I think the last survey was 6 years ago. Perhaps Alberto can correct me. But I think the annual consumption was like 2% of the population, something like that. I don't remember the figure by heart, but it was around that figure. But it is not so much. We don't have a so large cocaine market because right now we don't have so much money. And perhaps we have more consumption of marijuana. But I agree with you that around these local markets of drugs, there is a lot of violence going on around this micro traffic. And so I'm not so sure about the assessment about what, for example, what is going on in Rosario or in Uruguay, because we can, or Chile, we find social disorders, larger markets, and problems of governments to deal with this increasing violence. So I think that this like micro traffic, consumption, violence around that is one of the problems in the region.
No, thank you. One of the reasons I ask is because I will now reflect on what's been happening in Brazil, and certainly the maturation, the graduation of the Primeiro Comando da Capital from street prison gang into a very potent international organized crime group is one trend in Brazil. But the other trend is also the significant and very much related increase in cocaine consumption. Again, we don't have good statistics from either Brazil or Argentina, but some researchers believe that certainly a place like Brazil probably has per capita cocaine consumption at least on par with the United States, and perhaps even greater, as so much of US drug consumption has shifted so significantly toward opioids, and particularly synthetic opioids. And various of the themes that we heard so far today about find their echo in Brazil. So before COVID, we have been seeing essentially a war in various parts of Brazil between the Comando Vermelho and the Primeiro Comando da Capital, and in some places also militia. The militia formation is not localized just to Rio de Janeiro. And this was part of a trend then since the collapse of a policy in Brazil called UPP, a policy that focused on suppressing these street gangs that often controlled entire slum areas in Rio known as favela, have significantly increased both homicides and fighting with each other. So before COVID, there is this essentially tripolar fighting between the Comando Vermelho, Primeiro Comando da Capital, and the militias. And the PCC emerges as the victor out of that fight, and grows really into a very powerful regional organizations that recruits fighters, dissidents from the FARC in Colombia, for example, to enhance its fighting power, and that establishes the capacity to traffic cocaine, not just in the Southern Cone, but all the way to West Africa. And in doing so, sometimes competes, sometimes collaborates with the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Faísca Nova Generación. In the run-up to COVID and in the early months of COVID, as COVID was unfolding, Brazil was experiencing a homicide rate of over 30 per 100,000, by far higher than the numbers that we have heard so far, which peaked at about 63,000. And that sense of intense criminality, the disillusionment with the state-building UPP approach, that ran out of money, ran out of political will, that was funded by the commodity boom. And when the commodity boom ended, the UPP project ended, as well as the fact that the UPP project was trying to bring local community police to neighborhoods that had previously, for a long time, been run by gangs, never really succeeded in generating enough of this effective community police on time. So there was always a gap between the heavy police forces that would come in and the inability to generate enough and fast enough of the local police. So amidst the collapse and disillusionment of the UPP and the fight between the three criminal actors, COVID comes in and homicides are at about 63,000. And this is also an opportunity for President Bolsonaro to become president, to get himself elected. And he promises to launch policies to tackle crime, and does so through often controversial measures, significantly removing restraints on the use of force by police. He and his family relatives are officially promising or announcing that criminals would be shot on sight. And we have seen since then a decrease in homicides that the Bolsonaro government's certainly took credit for. Homicides last year were down to about 23 per 100,000, so a substantial decline by about from the 30 peak. But I would posit that a lot of the decline could really be explained not by the policies themselves, but by the fact that the commando, the Primero Comando de Capital, PCC, won and became really the dominant actor, organized crime actor, not just in Brazil, but increasingly establishing significant bases in other parts of Latin America, as well as facilitating the sale of cocaine through West Africa to Europe. And so some of the issues to watch is, how will this rise and emergence of the PCC interact with the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación? Are we going to see increasing frictions? Are we going to see the three actors trying to even more intensely line up local proxies, generating fights that we are seeing in places like Ecuador that we will hear about from Dr. Freeman? Will PCC have the same ability and aggressiveness to expand into other markets and to compete with the big Mexican cartels? Dr. Damert also spoke about the fact that drug trafficking is not the only crime in Chile, and for that matter in Latin America. And Brazil is a prime example with significant, very large criminal markets, illicit markets in logging and mining that are very complex and feature a great deal of different actors, some of whom are local artisanal miners or loggers, many of whom are legal corporations that behave illegally. Some are linked to China's, ours are locals. But nonetheless, we are already also seeing the greater interaction of the PCC with those markets as well. It's nowhere as developed as the penetration of the Sinaloa cartel into illegal fishing or legal fishing, into legal logging, or its essential takeover of fisheries in Mexico. But nonetheless, PCC is expanding, not just geographically, it's also expanding across functional domains. And of course, Brazil has been significantly challenged for at least 10 years, arguably longer than that, with the rise in cocaine and pasta básica consumption. Particularly places like Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro have been almost notorious by the way that cocaine consumption market have been playing out in the region. And just as Diego mentioned, there has been some initial emergence or at least anecdotal evidence of fentanyl in Argentina. We are seeing the same in Brazil. And that would certainly be a massive public health devastation, as well as another impetus for potentially further reshuffling of the criminal market and its greater complexities and violence. So much to talk then about as we will look in the next round at public security policies, responses. But before we go to that, I will now turn to Dr. Bill Freeman to tell us about Ecuador. Ecuador has been a lot in the news with dramatic developments there. And Dr. Friedman has been going there and studying it, as he has been other markets, in other criminal markets in Latin America. He is a fellow for Latin American studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he specializes on rule of law issues, the Andean regions and Northern Central America, as well as US relations with Latin America. He has done some brilliant work on corruption and how to tackle it, as well as on other organized crime and criminal market dimensions. And his analysis and commentary have appeared in major US newspapers as well as many academic journals. Bill, over to you, please.
Wanda, thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to take part today. Thank you to all the other panelists for filling us in on a situation across the region. And thanks finally to the Brookings Institution and Universidad de San Andrés for pulling this together. So in many ways, Ecuador is the outlier to the countries that we've been talking about today. It went from a situation like Chile's, Argentina's, or Uruguay's of relatively low violence by regional standards to becoming, I think this is not an exaggeration, the new Venezuela in terms of violence in Latin America. Ecuador wrapped up 2022 with the 4th highest homicide rate in Latin America, excluding the Caribbean, at nearly 26 out of 100,000. So that's higher than Mexico's, only behind Colombia's, Honduras's, and Venezuela's. And if murders continue at the current rate that they've been going in 2023, the country will end the year with 35 out of 100,000 homicides. So that would make it the 2nd most violent country in the entire region, just slightly behind where Venezuela was last year. Some of the cities on the Pacific coast, in particular in Ecuador, have become among the most violent in the region and the world. Manta, Guayaquil, Esmeraldas are hotspots. And there's even a canton on the road from Quito to Guayaquil that has registered 148 homicides out of 100,000. So just a couple things to underscore about this surge in violence. One, it's completely unprecedented in Ecuador. We're talking about a country which, in a very rare case for the Andean region, really had almost no meaningful insurgency in the 20th century, and also very little in the way of counterinsurgency. Also, this surge happened incredibly quickly, basically since the pandemic. When incumbent President Guillermo Lasso took office in 2001 until now, there's been a 300% increase in homicides. The biggest increase I've seen anywhere in Latin America. And I'll just note, far faster than the ramp up in violence in current hotspots like Honduras or Venezuela, which took years and years and years to build up to their current levels. So why are we seeing the violence? Let me just sketch out 3 reasons. So one is that I think we're seeing a battle for control of drug trafficking routes. According to the website Inside Crime, I think they put this well, Ecuador has become a cocaine superhighway. It was always sandwiched between the world's 2 largest producers, Colombia and Peru. But for a number of reasons I'll detail in a moment, it's recently become a magnet for transnational criminal groups and also fertile ground for local domestic groups. And more than anything else, it serves as a transshipment point in the global cocaine trade. Just last year, Ecuador registered, in fact, the 3rd most seizures in terms of cocaine in the world by volume. So just to give you a sense of the kind of volume of cocaine that's moving through the country. But now we're also seeing increasingly a battle, not only for control of drug trafficking routes, but also for control of other illicit markets like illegal mining and also extortion, which is growing very rapidly. A second reason I think that we're seeing violence spike in Ecuador is as a warning to political candidates and state authorities that would attempt to roll any of this back. Obviously, we saw that in a tragic form in early August with the assassination of the candidate Villavicencio, but also we've seen several other candidates and office holders gunned down in recent months. Car bombs placed outside the headquarters of the bureaucracy that manages prisons in Quito, for instance, and other really terrifying acts of violence. But to take a step back, I think those are the immediate reasons we're seeing violence now. But to go into the historical causes of this, I mean, how did Ecuador go from what was called this island of peace to this epicenter of violence in South America today? I think we have to deconstruct 2 incorrect but common narratives you'll hear in the country. So one comes from the followers of ex-President Rafael Correa in office from 2007 to 17, and the other comes from his opponents. And again, I don't see either as correct, and that might make me unpopular in Ecuador, but I see it as the truth. So one is that according to the Correistas, the surge in homicides we've seen, which has happened, yes, admittedly, largely under Presidents Lenin Moreno and Guillermo Lasso, who were rivals of Correa, they would argue that it's due to those two presidents' policies. I think there's a grain of truth to that. On the other hand, the anti-Correistas, followers of Lenin Moreno, Guillermo Lasso, and others, argue that really this is all the responsibility of Correa, that in his 10 years in office, he made a number of policy decisions which planted the seeds of the current crisis, which acted as a ticking time bomb, and were bound to explode sooner or later. I also think there's a grain of truth there. So how did all these presidents and their policy decisions contribute to what we're seeing now? Well, one, under Correa, I think there was a series of policy decisions that essentially ran down the immune system of the Ecuadorian state to organized crime, which weakened the state's capacity to monitor and push back on organized crime groups as they started establishing a hold. I could go into this further in Q&A, but just to give you a little bit of an idea, Ecuador under Correa, Ecuador doubled its prison population, leading to severe overcrowding, creating a breeding ground for gangs inside the prisons. As part of a geopolitical shift, Correa also closed a U.S. military base in Ecuador, which had been instrumental in helping monitor Ecuador's territorial waters, the 5th largest in South America. On top of that, he weakened a key investigative unit of the police, which he suspected of disobedience and disloyalty to him, but which really left the state without the means to continue monitoring narco-trafficking activity. And finally, contrary to his image as a fierce critic of neoliberalism, Correa actually put the ports and airports in Ecuador into private concession, which made it very hard to monitor inbound and outbound cargo. Now, that's what all the anti-Correistas would tell you. But what's the other side of the story? If Correa ran down the state's immune system to organized crime, it's really under Presidents Moreno and Lasso that Ecuador caught the disease and didn't take the necessary medicine. Some context here, in 2016, as Correa is about to leave office, you get the peace accord in Colombia, which demobilizes the FARC, historically the hegemonic actor in terms of drug trafficking in and through Ecuador. So it left a huge power vacuum, and you start to get a battle for control among various domestic groups with transnational contacts. So what happens under Moreno and Lasso? Well, first, Moreno, who's very focused on purging Correistas from the state, essentially let security slide. He dismantled Correa's justice ministry and significantly reshuffled the judiciary, but that had the effect of letting the prisons escape from the control of the state, creating reshuffles in police and other institutions, which caused a lot of disruption, essentially took the state's eye off the ball with crime just as it was starting to surge. And with Lasso, what you've seen is really a continuation of the same thing, a failure to change course. He's doubled down on optics, using the military to increasingly fight organized crime groups and cartels, kind of a traditional mano dura approach that almost harkens back to Felipe Calderón's war on the drug cartels in Mexico in 2006. But we have not seen under Moreno or Lasso a real attempt, a concerted attempt to roll back what I would argue is the underlying cause of all this, which is organized crime groups capturing parts of the state. What are those parts that would need to be uncaptured or freed from capture? The ports, the police, sections of the police, the prison system, and parts of the judiciary. All of those right now, as I'll get into in my section on policy prescriptions, really, parts of them do the bidding of organized crime, other parts tolerate impunity, several other operators under severe threat, which really makes it hard to begin to fight back. Finally, just to comment on one last thing I was asked to discuss, which was the international connections that we see in Ecuador. And this is, I think, rightly so. When you read about Ecuador in the press, especially English language press, this is one of the issues you'll see focused on most. Ecuador really has become a magnet for transnational organized crime groups because of its strategic position, again, between Colombia and Peru, the 2 largest producers of coca, and also for all of the vulnerabilities in Ecuador's institutions that I just discussed. So what groups do we see present? Probably most important are the Mexican organized crime groups. They replaced Colombians as the key intermediaries in shipping cocaine out of Ecuador. They're primarily the buyers. And I think they have some level of involvement in sponsoring and arming local groups, although it's hard to say exactly how much. So the Sinaloa cartel has been present for at least 20 years in Ecuador, has retained high-level contacts in the military as early as 2009 when there was a famous case exposed. And we know that the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación has been present at least for the last 3 years, getting logistical help from local Ecuadorian groups and in turn providing them arms and drugs. So that's all contributed to strengthening Ecuador's homegrown organized crime groups. Two you'll hear often about are Los Choneros and Los Lobos, the two strongest. But in addition to all of that sort of landscape, we also see Colombians still active, particularly the 48th Front of the FARC, a dissident front of the FARC, which continues growing cocaine, sending it across the border in southern Colombia. And then finally, last group you'll see mentioned, which is significant, fits slightly differently into the landscape, is the Albanian mafia. Present in Ecuador for at least 12 years, the Albanians specialize in contaminating the ports and contaminating major ships that leave, especially the port of Guayaquil, a huge port for the export of bananas, for instance, to the rest of the world. Right now, there's estimates that 50% of cocaine shipped out of Ecuador is moving through these channels, through contaminated ships. So Albanians are very present in that part of the landscape, and disturbingly have also been revealed for having high-level contacts in the state. Currently, President Lasso's brother-in-law is under investigation for alleged ties to the Albanian mafia in what seems to have been a rather sort of botched or covered-up investigation, which has now been reopened, raising a lot of very serious questions about how deeply the Albanian mafia in particular has managed to penetrate local institutions. So I'll stop there, but plenty more to say about the policies, approaches that have been tried with this really difficult situation in Ecuador, and also policy options that might do a better job. I'll just leave off by saying that a couple days ago, an Ecuadorian author wrote an op-ed saying that 2023 will probably be remembered as the point of no return when Ecuador became a narco state. It sounds extremely grim, and it would be a disaster for the region. I think it would turn Ecuador into something akin to the South American Honduras, one of these incredibly important transshipment countries where institutions are just deeply, deeply corrupted by the presence of so much organized crime activity. But I do think that it's not, in fact, alarmist what that author wrote, and that we do need to keep our eyes on Ecuador as things move forward.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Freeman. I on purpose left Ecuador for last, both because it's a place of such focus right now, but also because it's so emblematic of how fast things can unravel. And indeed, because the international dimensions are so strong. I am very glad that you highlighted the Albanian mafia, which is an actor or kind of umbrella actor. The name is quite really undefined and hides many sins and many separate entities. That is often not well known in Latin America. But we have seen significant expansion of criminal groups from the Balkans, particularly of the Albanian criminal groups, into Latin America. We are also seeing a significant push by these groups across Europe, from Britain to Germany, where they are competing with Turkish groups. And of course, the cocaine market is a very important part of that swirl. It's hardly the sole market. So glad that you brought it up, not something that many Latin American experts focus on, but an important dimension. So on the one hand, Sinaloa and Jalisco are pushing into Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia, but we are also seeing groups like the Albanian organized crime groups pushing into Latin America. I will now, in a much faster second round, give each of us an opportunity to reflect on policies, starting once again with Dr. Sanjurjo. But before I do that, I want to remind our viewers that you will have opportunity to ask questions. We have already received many questions in advance of the event and are receiving them continuously. I will take at least the last 30 minutes to get to your questions. You can email them to events@brookings.edu, or you can send them via Twitter with the hashtag SouthAmericaCrime. Dr. Sanjurjo, what are some of the policies that your government has adopted?
Yeah, first of all, to say that it was very interesting to hear all the colleagues. One comment about Ecuador that I find interesting is that I think Ecuador, as Will said, is an outlier here, also because different to Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, and Brazil as well. Ecuador used to have very, very high levels of violence. And in fact, in 2008, it had a very similar rate of homicide as it had last year, so it's like a country that apparently did things very well. It reduced its homicide rate significantly, and now it lost control of it again. But it's something that I wanted to ask Will before. Maybe he can comment it later, because it's not the same case as in the other countries. Now, turning again to Uruguay, there were 2 years during the COVID years that I wouldn't say that we lost them, but because we saw that every single type of crime was being reduced, every semester, there were a lot of things that we left for these final years. And we thought initially that we were doing things right, which indeed we were, because most crimes have continued going down. But homicides, as I said before, homicides and specifically homicides related to the drug trade have spiked again, have gone up again in the last year. And that has made us, basically rethink what we should do. So we are putting forward this year a whole battery of measures that we hope that we can see the results of them before the elections, which is in only 1 year ahead of us. So the first things that we are doing is we are drastically changing the controls we have on the port. Uruguay is a very small country, as you know. We only have one big port, and that is where the entire cocaine transit is moving forward. And sadly, we were probably one of the ports with the least or the lesser controls in the region. We only had like one big scanner that was extremely old, that got that was being broken, probably by corruption, like every 2 weeks, and that made our port a very easy port to pass drugs along. And this is gonna, or we hope that this is gonna change dramatically, because we bought 1.5 years ago 3 new scanners. These are supposed to be like, among the best that you can find internationally. And this should allow us to be the port that controls the most shipments in the region. And this is not a minor thing, because one hypothesis that we are working on is that because Uruguay is such a small market for the drug trade, in the sense that we said it before, it said, Lucia and Diego talked about this, that it is closely, the violence is closely related to the drug demand in the country, and our drug demand is so small. There is an hypothesis that maybe if we can control the port and make the drug transit less attractive to drug criminals, then maybe the demand or the offer in Uruguay will lower significantly, and that hopefully will bring down violence. Now, that is one thing we're doing for the transit of drugs to other countries. But in Uruguay and in Montevideo and in the neighborhoods where homicides are very much focused in Uruguay, we are doing now a number of things. One first thing is that we just built or created a homicide intelligence unit that is locally working locally in these neighborhoods. These are policemen specialized in investigations that have been working in these specific neighborhoods for many years, and we have made a unit that is specific for those neighborhoods. This is one thing. The other thing is that we are going to bring to Uruguay the program Cure Violence, which maybe some of you know. It is a program that works in the US and in some countries in the region, and it tries to prevent homicides and prevent shootings, working with NGOs and with local communities. So a first mission of Cure Violence was in Uruguay 2 weeks ago, and they are very, very optimistic about working in Uruguay, basically because it is going to be the first time that a country works with them where violence is not that as widespread as it is in other countries. And also because homicides, again, are so heavily focused on a few neighborhoods of Montevideo, which makes such a program, maybe, we hope, much more fruitful, so this is probably going to start working at the beginning of 2024. Another program that we have is a whole battery of technologies that we are putting forward. So we installed or are installing around 3,000 cameras in these neighborhoods that are, all of them are in the outskirts of Montevideo. We have a big camera CCTV system, but these are mostly in the neighborhoods where there is less violence, so to say. So now we are changing that, and we are putting 3,000 cameras in those neighborhoods where we are seeing the most violence. And we are experimenting with different technologies. So we have a pilot program that has to do with facial recognition. And in other neighborhoods, we have a program that has to do with artificial intelligence that should let analysts know by itself when a crime is being committed. And at the same time, we have another part of these neighborhoods where we are putting forward one of these, what's this called? Shot spotter programs. It's like microphones that should be able to detect and identify shootings and let the police know before anybody calls 911. So we have these 3 different pilots, along with a big installation of cameras in these very violent neighborhoods where we haven't had cameras until now. So let's see how this moves along. And we are also going to bring, as I said, cure violence. So it's going to be like an interesting experiment to see how all of this works. Let me finish up, and to finish, to say something about the challenges that Uruguay faces and which we haven't had the possibility of work on. So the first thing is prisons. Uruguay has the second or the first prison population per inhabitant in the region. It's the 10th largest in the world. And the truth is that no government, including this one, has done enough on rehabilitation. So if we talk about drug consumption, maybe leading or bringing the violence to our countries, then rehabilitation and drug treatment is key. And this is something that Uruguay has not done enough and should start doing more heavily. So yeah, those are the politics or the policies that I would, I don't know if recommend, because we are at this moment starting to implement them, but we are hoping that they bring a big change in Uruguay in the near future. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'm also just fascinated by the combination of more of the thrust on technology in combination with some of the more human street type of work oriented focus, such as cure violence. Thus, all too often it's easy to slip into the technological fixes. And China, of course, is on a massive push across Latin America to be selling technologies, anti-crime technologies, such as smart cities, as a solution to the crime problems that the Latin American government or US assistance failed to deal with. Technologies that are very problematic from the perspective of civil rights and human rights and civil liberties, but also could be a backdoor for China spying. Dr. Damed, let me turn toward you for what is your thoughts on what can be done in Chile, and Chile emblematic of one of the success story that is now struggling in preventing the violence rise and the deterioration of public security to become even worse.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad I'm speaking after Diego, because I think most of the things that Diego mentioned, cure violence as an innovation program, and also, CCTV and technology and artificial intelligence and security, everything we are also developing. We are trying to, do. But this reminds me of us 20 years ago, when we were trying to, tackle other security issues. And we were all talking about Nonstate and community policing and problem-oriented policing and all those, buzzwords of that era. And my sense is that those are very important, and we are also changing laws. We are, increasing. We are in a phase in Chile that increasing levels of punishment is perceived as something that is going to have some results. I have my doubts because it hasn't worked anywhere in the world, but perhaps, you can find a specific situation here. But my sense is that there are at least 5 areas that we really need to focus on in Latin America and specifically in Chile. First of all, we need to focus and tackle the internal drug demand. I mean, you can see what is happening in the US, after millions of dollars being basically wasted in many issues regarding police and criminal justice initiatives. There are lots of people dying on the streets because of fentanyl. Of course, the US situation is different from us because drug traffickers are not killing themselves on the streets. But around 90% of the cocaine being produced in the southern part of Latin America is being consumed there. So something is happening. Either they have a better market regulation inside, or they have, other alternative issues that are not allowing violence on the street within those organizations. But the fact of the matter is that if we continue to have 1/3 of all our citizens searching for either cocaine or synthetic drugs, we are going to have the market. So that is something that we have to, it's very difficult when you're in the government to discuss these issues because, of course, citizens are requesting tough hands and tough laws and something that really works out. And we can discuss this later on the Bukele type of government. But at least in Chile, the governmental responses to the problem of drug addiction are really weak, and we need to continue enhancing that, not only for general population, but more specifically for the population that happen to have been in jail. As I mentioned, almost half of those killed in homicide last year have a previous record being on the jail system. So something has to be done in that area. Second, there is no organized crime developed in a country, even though if you don't have corruption. So I think we really need to focus on electoral programs in order of financing the programs that finance politics. We need to enhance fiscalization and other type of measures in order to limit corruption, not only in ports or in the borders, but throughout. You can figure out every time you see criminal organizations being developed on illegal markets, but by that matter, you can see that the gray area, is really thin, and you have a normal legal area that is getting stronger and stronger everywhere in the world. So here in Chile, we have had a couple of presidential councils trying to fight increasing levels of corruption, but there is still, I think there is, a longer way to walk in order to have a sound policy that would limit corruption, and that will also tackle the development of these legal markets. Third, there is no way that we can tackle this issue if we don't have a regional response. For instance, in the case of these regional organizations, those criminal organizations that are moving throughout Latin America, they are moving throughout different countries, and they can do that because there is no complex, organized response. And I think that in that area, 20 years ago, unfortunately, we were in a better situation than now. The levels of mistrust within institutions are higher. Fourth, And this is something that the government of Chile in the last perhaps 10 years have been trying to focus on, but still we are not really able to have a sound strategies money laundering. We have, as everyone in this panel have mentioned, we have very profitable markets. However, everyone on the jail system, everyone is really poor. So where is exactly that money? And that question we haven't been able to answer. And I think that is something that we really need to focus on, not only in Chile, but in other countries. And finally, although organized crime is really important, we also have, regular crime based on the, typical factors that determine criminal careers, such as dropout of schools. After COVID, we have many kids who haven't come back to schools. And this is a problem in Chile. I think the number is 50,000 kids who are actually outside the school system. So we also have problems with drug consumption, with mental health issues, with people who are not getting jobs, with teen pregnancy. So those typical, more social factors, we really need to put them again on the spotlight, because one of the troubles of only focusing on criminal organization and specifically, this regional criminal organization is the fact that we can shuffle the spotlight into these very, high-tech, highly complex type of responses. But at the end of the day, what we have in Latin America is thousands of kids who are unable to find jobs that will allow them to survive, and that see criminal activities as a regular way of surviving. So this is another area that in which we also have to work. I know that there are conversations to bring cure violence here. It will be nice, Diego, to talk about how we are going, how these both countries who used to be safe could develop cure violence, because I know how they did it in Central America, and it was very difficult to implement, because of the type of gangs and the type of local criminal organizations that we have. But in that sense, my perception is that we are still running behind as governments. We are cybercrime.
Yeah,
I just want to finish with the cybercrime dilemma, because we are still focusing on these issues. But in terms of cybercrime, I think this is a huge menace that is growing throughout the region, and we have no policies for that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. A very important issue that the initiative can focus on. And Brazil, of course, is a big actor in cybercrime, and cybercrime is changing and becoming more complex. I also want to highlight your comment that the local cultural and institutional setting has often played a very significant factor in policy effectiveness. And policies that were effective in places like Boston or the United States, whether it was focused deterrence or other social policies, have often struggled to have anywhere near that effectiveness rate or effectiveness at all outside of the US, including in the various Latin American contexts. Diego, let me turn to you. You're running a little bit later than I would like, but I want to still allow a lot of opportunity for questions from the audience. So if you can please be quite pithy and focused in your policy recommendations.
First, I want to pose some questions about what is next. What will happen with this rocketing cocaine export through Latin America? What will happen with the Primer Comando de Capital? They will invite us in revenge of the World Cup. What will happen with the fentanyl? Finally, it will come down to the Southern Cone, creating a huge crisis. We have a lot of challenges. And going to policy challenges, of course, I think that corruption, as Lucia said, is very important, and to strengthen the state capacities to protect against the organized crime penetration. Also, the lack of investigation and intelligence capacities that it is and the capacities to disarticulate crime organizations is a very important issue in the whole region, including Argentina. And going to international cooperation at the regional level, just an example, we don't share in automatic basis our crime records, and that is incredible. But we have more or less free movement of persons, but we don't share the crime records. And going to another level of international cooperation, I think that, as I said, it is useful, but also it can cause problems, so cannot focus the most important problems. Our most important problems are regarding violence or related to local dynamics, but international law enforcement is focused on international trends. If we export cocaine, for example, but not in the local gangs that provoke more the largest amount of homicides. And also, we have witnessed in our work in the region a lot of almost crazy situations regarding international cooperation. For example, in Ecuador, international cooperation strengthened the export control capacities, but they didn't look at the import capacities. So the import control capacities are almost not existent according to the Ecuadorian official. So also there is some divergence between actors and institutions. I have witnessed foreign army officers talking to local army officers about law enforcement, but they were not in charge of law enforcement. Or international multilateral organizations talking to intelligence people or police people very tough about childhood social prevention. That is an important issue, but you are not in charge. And that is almost the bread and butter of what I've seen in the region. There is a lack of, I think, of focus and logical work in these issues for a large number of reasons. But I think that we have a lot of opportunities also to work. As I said, in information sharing, there is a lot. Intelligence and capacities, we have a lot to do. And as we have a so low level of capacities, I think that it can be a low hanging fruit.
Well, thank you very much, Diego. As Lucia mentioned, the cooperation is very important, and yet it's a challenge. It's been a challenge for years and years. And of course, there are new actors in the cooperation trying to insert themselves in the cooperation, such as China and its pitch for its anti-crime policies. So what's happening with Brazil? Well, the Lula administration so far has more or less responded to the public security challenge through sporadic, episodic approach. It more or less responds to particular incidents of violence in schools or in prison, rather than having yet a robustly developed overall strategy. It's, of course, enjoying the decline in homicides that the Bolsonaro administration claims as the result of its policies. I would posit it was the result of the PCC victory in significant parts of Brazil. Certainly, the administration has, the Lula administration has phrased its national security, national public safety strategy as not just one of policing, but also of focusing on socioeconomic approaches to crime. That is very welcome, but the details are not known so far, and nor is the budget. And it's important to reflect here, of course, that the time is very different. I mentioned that the big spike in homicides came out of the collapse and withering of the pacification policy, the UPP policy in Rio, that in my view was very well designed, but required time and failed to address some core issues. Nonetheless, in the overall strategic design, in my view, it was sound, even if its operationalization struggled, and certainly there was neither the political will nor the budget. But what happened with the collapse of UPP was, I think, a much greater souring on that kind of state-building project that it would take to bring safety to citizens living in marginalized neighborhoods, that it would take for the state to become the principal provider of security and public services in the favelas. So there is almost an allergic reaction not to repeat the UPP without even having the funding that UPP for a while had, insufficient as that was. The second problem or the second challenge for the public safety and policing strategy, law enforcement strategy in Mexico, in Brazil rather, is that the PCC to some extent has become like the Mexican criminal groups. Though nowhere as potent, it's not just a street, favela, prison gang. It is an international organization. Like the cartels, it is pushing into various other illegal economies, and it is pushing internationally. So whatever the local approach to particular neighborhoods is, it's insufficient in also dealing with the international dimensions. Finally, the long-standing problems of countering money laundering, using financial intelligence to go after proceeds of organized crime groups persist in Brazil as they do in many Latin American countries. Even in Brazil, the judiciary is still weak, meek, often lacks prosecutable evidence, and this despite the fact that Brazil became well known for its activist judges, and control of prison remains a significant challenge, with prison continually producing not just members of street gangs, but also feeder for the larger organized crime groups. And more can yet happen if we are going to start seeing real tough competition between the PCC and the Mexican cartels. I wouldn't expect it in Brazil itself. There, the PCC and to a lesser extent Comando Vermelho and other organized crime group, Brazilian crime groups have robust control, but we could certainly start seeing this playing out in various other parts of Latin America, as well as potentially in West Africa. Mindful of time, Will, I will turn to you for your concluding comments in this round on what are the pros and cons of different policing approaches, what should be done, and then I will start taking questions from the audience. Thank you again for submitting them. If you want to submit further questions, you can do so at events@brookings.edu or the hashtag South America Crime. Will, last word to you.
Thanks. First, just to Dr. Sanjurjo to respond to that important comment. I think you're right to note that violence in Ecuador was rising in the mid-2000s, late to the late 2000s. I'm not sure, though, that personally I'd be wary of comparing it to the violence we've seen recently. Homicide spiked, but it was mostly due to local gang activity, not as involved in transnational narco trafficking, and I think much less corrosive of Ecuadorian institutions. So in a way, it was an easier problem to roll back. Again, I just think important distinction to make, because if you were to equate the two, you could essentially draw the lesson that, okay, today what a new government in Ecuador should do is replicate the policies and strategies used during the second government of Rafael Correa, which included doubling the prison population, increasing policing to go after kind of petty crime, things like that, legalizing one of the largest gangs, the Latin Kings. But I'm not sure that any of those solutions would really correspond or work to solve the problem that we see today, which again are these transnational groups linking up with new, much more powerful domestic organized crime syndicates and operating together. So just in terms of what I think would help Ecuador turn the tide, again, at the root of all of this, I see Ecuador's most fundamental challenge today being co-optation of the state, somewhat like what parts of Colombia saw during the height of Políticas, the fusion of paramilitaries with politics, or what we've seen in parts of Central America. So in terms of what can be done to get out of this situation, I mean, I think there are, again, a few key institutions that a next government or a next few governments need to target. One are the ports. As I mentioned, huge volumes of cocaine are moving through contaminated ships in the ports, despite promises by the Lasso government and others that scanners are on the way, that scanners are being installed, that we'll see huge progress on this. We haven't yet. How to change that situation? You know, Fernando Villavicencio, just days before he was killed, had one idea, which was to put the military in control of the ports. You can disagree with that, and you know, I'm sure that it would come with serious risks, but I think some serious overhaul is needed in that sector. In terms of the police, I think the next government or next few need to build back a special investigative unit like the one that was dismantled almost 10 years ago. A kind of elite police unit that's going to have much more capacity to trace drug trafficking shipments and also trace the money, because that's so often what we're not seeing with these investigations. In terms of the judiciary and prosecutors, my fear is that we'll continue to see a lot of push and pull between correístas and anti-correístas over corruption investigations. What we really need here are new and unified standards on the use of habeas corpus, which we've seen abused to free gang leaders and organized crime leaders across Ecuador in recent years. And then finally, in terms of the prison, currently the prison system is being managed by a much too small bureaucracy that was created just a few years ago under the presidency of Lenin Moreno. This bureaucracy needs to be beefed up. It needs to be made more autonomous and given more capacity. So it's a huge and ambitious list. I'm not sure I see Ecuador leaving its current situation without the presence of some kind of international mission, somewhat like Guatemala's CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity. Short of that, I personally really don't know how you turn that corner. And I'm sure everyone's following, Ecuador has elections coming up, a presidential runoff. It'll be an unusually short term that the next president holds, but the two top contenders, interestingly, have not been emphasizing the mano dura approach we're seeing gain traction in the region with figures like Bukele. Instead, they've both emphasized social programs, community policing, conflict resolution. Look, I think those are often overlooked and very important proposals. But what's concerning here is that they're not really talking about the issues of institutional capture and how to reverse them. And again, for me, that is the point without which you cannot start to solve this problem in Ecuador. So that's my ideas on sort of policy solutions to get out of this. Looking forward to hearing what the questions are from the audience.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for those very important analytical and policy prescription remarks. I will now start taking questions and curating them and bunching them. And let me actually start with Will and Lucia. So for each of you, we have received questions that essentially ask why geography is not tyranny. So Lucia, one of the questions for you is, why is Chile risen to a point of being the fourth most largest departure point for cocaine for Europe, since Chile is on the Pacific coast? How does that figure? And Will, for you, the geography, why is geography not tyranny question, or why it is tyranny question? One of our viewers is asking, why is Ecuador such an important cocaine transshipment point at this point? Why are Colombian and Mexican criminal groups not satisfied to go through places like Buenaventura and other Colombian transshipment points? And one more question for you, Lucia. And actually, let me make that a question for everyone, which asks about the role of Venezuelan migrants. There is tremendous scapegoating of Venezuelan migrants frequently, and there are allegations that they have become important vectors of crime. Is that true or not? So for Lucia, as well as everyone, the question on Venezuela, and for Lucia and Will, geography as tyranny or not? Lucia, let me start with you.
Okay. Well, the geography question, what that shows is that the complexity and the organization and the global presence and the technology that criminal organizations are using I think that what they realized is that perhaps shipments coming from Chile were less policized, that they realized that in the ports in Chile, there were not such a strong presence of police enforcement, or was not really concerned about, the presence of drug trafficking. So there is a window of opportunity. There is also anecdotal evidence that says that in some cases, the chips are being, filled in the middle of the process, not in the Chilean ports, but basically in the middle of the sea. So as soon as that happened, and the Chilean government actually enhanced the presence of the police and enhance technology in order to fight that traffic, then not because of that only, but then you can see a change on the routes of the whole traffic of cocaine specifically. So also that has to do with the fact that this government and the previous two enhance the presence of the armed forces in the frontier with Peru and Bolivia, more specifically Bolivia, because of the migrant, but also the drug trafficking route. So my sense is that that's the main explanation, because it's very difficult to find that the Peruvian cocaine will go all the way to Chile, to go back to Europe. It's supposed to be easier to just send it through Colombia or through Venezuela. But those countries, shipments coming from those countries were mostly revised, and we have a lot of police eye on those. And in the case of the migrant crime relationship, and I would put in general, because there is also the relationship with the Colombian migration here in Chile and others. So there is an increasing discourse and narrative that links migration with increasing levels of crime. The data that we have does not corroborate that situation. However, there are three elements that I think are important to take into account. First, there is a group of people coming from different countries who are socializing in violent type of relationships that use violence as a regular means of relationship with others, that in many cases get into criminal organizations. And they, are very much linked to homicides and use of armed violence and stuff. Second, because this is a regional, even global phenomenon, you have people from Colombia, from Peru, and from Venezuela coming to Chile in order to make together the relationship with those organizations who are actually buying cocaine, or bringing, human trafficking, or being linked to traffic of migrants. And that is something that it's very much ascertained in the data. However, in most cases, the organizations that are being, detained by the police are organizations run by locals with the presence of perhaps some migrants. And third, I think we have to be very careful, as I mentioned before, when we have this discussion on the Global Initiative for Criminal Organization, GTOC, when we're discussing with experts on on organized crime throughout the Americas. We all have different data from our own local, intelligence forces or police institutions. And in most cases, the whole narrative blame migrants and criminal and international criminal organizations for the issues that are happening in our country. So I believe that there is more data, there is more perhaps judicial/police investigations that have to be implemented in order to be certain that we can say that Venezuelans, organized Venezuelans, are actually, getting together and making a plan to move from Caracas or whatever into Santiago de Chile in order to have, control of drug trafficking, for instance. That sounds to me hard to believe, because local criminals are not that willing to leave the whole market to others. So I think it's a more complex situation than just, a regular transit of specific groups.
Thank you very much. Will, your thoughts?
Sure. So on the question of is Ecuador's situation purely a product of geography, or in this case, is geography destiny or a curse? I think it's geography plus a few other factors, not least infrastructure. So interestingly, in Ecuador, there's a much better network of roads than there is in southern Colombia. From parts of Putumayo or Nariño, we're talking about anywhere between it's 10 hours shorter to drive to the major ports like Esmeraldas in Ecuador, or it's 3, but somewhere in there from you gain an extra 3 to 10 hours that you would have spent traveling to Buenaventura. On top of that, I think we've seen, as I described, Ecuadorian institutions gradually weakened and made more permeable to capture, whereas in Colombia, although not without fits and starts, we've seen kind of the opposite process since the 2000s. I had to add to that their geopolitical relationships. Colombia has maintained strong cooperation with the DEA, which has provided surveillance equipment and help monitoring the area for narco traffickers. The situation for many years in Ecuador was the opposite, leaving its huge territorial waters, much larger than the country itself, susceptible to incoming narco trafficking activity. And then finally, sort of one peculiarity here is that one of Ecuador's largest exports is bananas. They need to move very quickly through the ports or they'll spoil. So in the case of Guayaquil, for instance, that makes it very hard to actually, go through and bust these containers or do kind of strict monitoring, just because of the speed at which the shipping is happening. So those are all a few reasons. One more is that Ecuador has very, very weak migration controls compared to pretty much every other country in the region. There was a concept called universal citizenship put into the 2008 constitution, which really, really weakens any kind of capacity to control who's coming in and out of the country. All of that has made it a magnet on top of its geography. So I don't think geography was enough alone, but when you couple it with all those other factors, it creates a pretty difficult dilemma.
Yeah, excellent answers. I would also just add more broadly that all traffickers like diversified routes. A foolish drug trafficking group will pick the most direct, most obvious route. We're seeing various drug shipments going through Africa, where you would think that would be the last place to be going through, the least efficient way to do it. And yet we are seeing that happening as well. And I'm not just talking about cocaine going through West Africa to Europe, but the smuggling of meth and fentanyl precursors, for example. Will, do you want to make any comments on the Venezuelan migrants before I go to Diego, both Diegos, on that issue?
Well, I'll just say that, what I've seen and heard talking to people in Ecuador, I think there has been an involvement of Venezuelan groups like Tren de Aragua in terms of training and equipping contract killers. That's kind of how they're inserted into this whole landscape. Even reports of some Ecuadorians traveling to camps in Venezuela to train and coming back. In some cases working also with the ELN. But you do see this tendency, a bit like Dr. Dammit was talking about, sometimes among some observers to claim that because Ecuador used to be a relatively peaceful country, now it's not, that the culprits are entirely transnational groups. And that's simply not the case. There's also very powerful domestic organized crime groups in Ecuador today. I think if the transnational groups were to disappear, they wouldn't be as well equipped and armed and maybe financed, but they would still be very, very powerful, formidable, and a force to be reckoned with.
Thank you so much, both Diegos, the questions on Venezuelan migrants, but let me also add a specific question to each of you. So for Dr. Sanjurjo, the question is to elaborate on the Uruguay cannabis policy. So you mentioned that it hasn't had an impact on crime one way or another. That is fascinating because often the justification for legalizing the cannabis markets is to prevent the initiation of cannabis users into harder drugs through contact with dealers that sell other drugs. So, any kind of thoughts on what's working well, what is a challenge? This perhaps surprising finding that it really hasn't had any impact one way or another on organized crime and crime patterns. And to Mr. Fleitas, the second question for you specifically asks about what's happening with Buenos Aires, what's happening in terms of the crime rates there, what are the crime statistics in Buenos Aires? You spoke about Rosario. What are the comparisons between the two? Maybe let me go to Dr. Sanjurjo first.
So, sure. Regarding migrants, it is not really a perceived problem in Uruguay. It really isn't. Yesterday we had, for instance, or last week we had a gang of a group of scammers who came from Colombia, who were loaning money on very excessive rates, and they were taken into custody. That was last week, but that is rather, I would say, absolutely exceptional. And that probably has to do with the fact that Uruguay, if any of you have ever been here, is a very expensive country to live in. Things are very, very expensive here. So migrants that arrive to Uruguay usually either have they are well settled, so to speak, or they come to Uruguay and they go somewhere else. I think that probably has to do with the fact that we don't usually see people coming from Colombia who are somehow involved from Colombia or from Venezuela or other countries who are involved in crime. I would say it's very, very unusual. Then regarding the legalization of cannabis, so that was a big issue, as you can imagine here, 5 years ago or so. Cannabis was legalized in Uruguay, was the first country to do so nationally in 2014. And we had 3 ways of acquiring cannabis legally. One was to plant your own cannabis at home. The other one was to be a part of a cannabis club. And the third one was to be able to buy cannabis from a drugstore. The first 2 ways were legalized or started working as of 2014. The final one only started working in 2017. And the truth is that crime during those years, both in 2014 as in 2017, governments were from the Frente Amplio, and crime was rising steadily. All types of crimes were rising steadily each year by year, basically. And this didn't change. This didn't change at all. There was a big spike in crime in late 2018, but that was probably related to a much broader change in the penal code, and not really in cannabis. So again, what we have is if it somehow had an impact on crime, we don't have any studies that show that. Crime has grown and has been reduced with this policy in action. And the evaluations that we do have from academia and also international academics, what they suggest is that it has not had an impact on the rate of consumption, even though consumption continued growing. It also did in other countries such as Chile, such as Argentina. So it probably didn't have an impact on that either. However, I would say that the consumption of cannabis has normalized a lot in Uruguay, and also among young people, which is not a good thing. So it is a very common thing now, or much more common than before, to see adolescents smoking cannabis, outside and inside schools, for example, which is a big problem for education mostly. But we do not have any evidence that suggests that it has had an impact on, in any case, on crime. Why that is, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but it hasn't had so far.
Well, thank you so much, Diego Fleitas.
To compare cities, I think is a very interesting exercise to ask what went wrong in Rosario, or what went wrong in Montevideo in the last 10 years, and what went better in our cities. For example, Cordoba is similar to Cordoba city is similar to Rosario, and they had established a stable homicide rate, a stable crime situation. But going to Buenos Aires, I think that in general we have underreporting problems about crime. But anyway, in the case of Buenos Aires City, the levels are low. In the city declares like a rate around 3.5, that perhaps or probably it is a bit higher. And it is a pretty safe city. In the case of the Great Buenos Aires, that belongs to the Buenos Aires province, we have very complex places with a lot of crime, like some places at the west of Buenos Aires in La Matanza or San Martin, with a large presence of more or less organized crime. Again, we have crime reporting problems there. For example, La Matanza right now appears to have a European rate of homicide. I can't believe that. We analyzed in detail the figures, and they don't look consistent. So we think that there are some problems there. But anyway, beyond the crime that perhaps we can find in Gran Buenos Aires, it didn't went so much out of control as Rosario. And the question is why? Why Gran Buenos Aires, also with a lot of poverty and corruption and so on, didn't go so bad as Rosario? One of the hypotheses that the Buenos Aires police kept the control for good and for bad of the crime. They regulated the crime, so the crime never went so high. It's like perhaps in New York in the early 20s, very early 20s, that the police was in charge of crime. And so, but also we should ask ourselves how long we can stand this situation if it cannot get worse. For example, this fentanyl cocaine problem within the Gran Buenos Aires in San Martin. So perhaps we are sat on a time bomb. So when it's a big problem, certainly the next government will have to do a lot about the Gran Buenos Aires.
Thank you very much, Diego. This brings us close to concluding. Let me thank all of you for your incredibly insightful remarks. But before I do that, let me just reflect on your concluding comment here. Is fentanyl a time bomb? I think it is very likely that the fentanyl epidemic will spread from North America, not just the United States, but equally much Canada today, and emerging significantly in Mexico to other parts of the world. And we can kind of wonder why we haven't seen a significant rise in fentanyl use in Western Europe yet, especially as the Taliban appears to have suppressed cultivation of opium poppy, but perhaps 90% over the past year. Something yet to be seen whether the Taliban will maintain that. But I would highlight to all of us that there are always time lags between how the use of particulate drugs spreads and how it is pushed by drug trafficking organizations. And speaking about the Southern Cone or South America today, and cocaine is very emblematic of that. Back in the 1990s, there was plenty of cocaine production in Latin America for cocaine to be heading to Europe. And it didn't, just because European drug suppliers were used to heroin. predominantly facilitated by Italian organized crime groups, as well as other crime groups. And then all of a sudden comes the mid-1990s, we see this big burst of Latin American, Colombian crime groups establishing relations with the Italian, bringing in cocaine, and cocaine takes off in Europe to the extent that today it is, I would argue, far more important market, demand market than the United States, where cocaine is on its way out and essentially is kept alive because of fentanyl. Synthetic drugs simply bring tremendous advantages to drug trafficking groups. They do not require the control of territory. They make hiding shipments, whether of precursors or of finished drugs, far easier. They are much cheaper, both to produce, but also consequently the corruption and bribery involved in it is much lower. And so it's not surprising that we are seeing places like Afghanistan becoming producers of methamphetamine. Pakistan last year, a place like Karachi, had greater shipments of meth than of heroin. So in my view, it is very likely that fentanyl and other synthetic drugs will come to the southern cone, will come to Latin America, which will not only pose new massive challenges in terms of violence and organized crime groups and their captures of state institutions, but also in terms of public health. And obviously preventing that needs to be a core part of what drug and crime policies focus on. With that, a very many thanks to our highly distinguished speaker, Dr. Diego Sanjurjo, Mr. Diego Fleitas, Dr. Lucia Damer, and Dr. Bill Friedman. Enormous thanks also to Dr. Alberto Ferrick and the Centro for Strategic Policy and Global Affairs at the Universidad de San Andrés for partnering with us today for hosting this event, but also partnering with us in May for hosting an event on illegal fishing. The recording is on YouTube. I highly recommend that you check it out. And finally, tremendous thanks to all of you who have joined us today for your participation, your time, and your thoughtful questions. Please continue watch the initiative of Nonstate Armed Actors as we put out reports and events further in the fall.